So, all in the last few days, the Seahawks have traded DK Metcalf to the Steelers, traded Geno Smith to the Raiders, released Tyler Lockett, and now signed Sam Darnold to a $100 million contract. And a lot of people are left with the question, what the hell are the Seahawks doing? Well, in this video, I want to try to answer that and justify what the Seahawks were thinking, why they were willing to move on from Geno Smith in the first place, and why they were willing to sign Sam Darnold immediately after to be the future of their franchise, or at least for the time being, to be the face of their franchise. So, to answer those questions, the first thing we have to do is take a look at the Geno Smith situation as a whole. So, back in 2022, the Seahawks signed Geno Smith. No one expected anything of it. The Seahawks were honestly assumed to be one of the worst teams in the NFL going into the 2022 season, and that's not really what happened at all. Instead, the Seahawks made the playoffs in 2022. Geno Smith had a career year throwing for over 30 touchdowns, and the vibes in Seattle were actually very high around this time, with people believing that they had a chance to build on this roster and maybe become contenders. Unfortunately, over the next couple of seasons, the Seahawks would regress, missing the playoffs both years, despite a 10-7 record in 2024, which usually is good enough for at least a wild card spot, but they missed the playoffs nevertheless. And then the Seahawks realized we're about to have to pay Geno Smith, and we're willing to do that, but we're not willing to break the absolute bank on him. And they offered him a $40 to $45 million contract, reportedly, which he turned down and requested a trade afterwards. And the Seahawks, I'm sure, could have saved this situation if they really wanted Geno Smith in Seattle. But they looked at the situation and they said, okay, Geno Smith has been good for us, but we have hit a wall. We have not progressed from where we were when we first signed him. So, should we pay him big money or should we shop elsewhere for a quarterback? And then they took a look at Sam Darnold and they said, he just had a career year in Minnesota. I mean, he just threw for 35 touchdowns and 4,319 yards. And they were like, well, that's better than any season Geno Smith has ever had. Now, albeit the situation in Minnesota last year was incredible for the Vikings. Justin Jefferson is one of the best receivers in the NFL, if not the best receiver in the NFL. And honestly, the Seahawks don't have anything even similar to that in talent. In fact, I think now the Seahawks probably have one of the worst receiving cores in the NFL. Obviously, I like Jackson Smith and Jigba, and I think that he's a really good receiver. But outside of him, they basically have no one. And this is a really stark contrast to how I've viewed the Seahawks offense for a long time now, because I viewed them as one of the better offenses in the NFL with a really good receiving core. And I will say I do understand why the Seahawks chose to move on from both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I mean, with Lockett, it's really simple. He's just getting up there in age. He's not the receiver that he used to be. But with DK Metcalf, they just didn't want to pay that much money for him. And to some extent, I do understand where they're coming from. I mean, the Steelers gave him a $150 million contract, and I just don't think there's any ballpark in which he's worth that much. I think DK is a good receiver. I really do. I think that he can play as a one, but I don't think that he's an elite one. And for that reason, I wouldn't be willing to give him $150 million. So to some extent, I do think the Seahawks made the right decision moving on from DK, but the problem is now they have to find a way to surround Sam Darnold with the talent that he needs in order to be as good as he was last year. And for the record, I do think that Sam Darnold could continue to be a good quarterback. I don't think that it's a fluke that he threw for 35 touchdowns and 4,200 yards or whatever it was. Like, he's a really solid quarterback. And I think that the situation around quarterbacks determines how good they're going to be most of the time. So if the Seahawks think that they can give Sam Darnold the tools that he needs in order to replicate that success, then it makes sense to give him that contract. It makes sense that they would be willing to take that gamble on him, knowing what they know about him from last year. But it all comes down to whether or not they can actually do it. Whether or not they can actually give him the weapons that he needs. Whether or not they can give him the O-line that he needs to replicate that success. And as it stands, the Seahawks do have the resources to go and get a better situation offensively. I mean, they have quite a bit of draft capital. They have $50 million or so left in cap that they can spend to improve the situation. So I don't think that people should be down on this Sam Darnold signing because it gives the Seahawks a little more money than they would have had re-signing Geno Smith for a player that I don't view as wildly different than Geno Smith in the first place. Like, I don't think that Sam Darnold's ceiling is astronomically higher than what Geno Smith's can be in a loaded offense, but I think that it makes a lot of sense when you're saving the money to go after Sam Darnold instead of giving that money to Geno Smith and having less to build around.